Ladies and gentlemen, Psalms 18 verse 4 to 6 says, "The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of hell surrounded me, and the snares of death prevented me from breathing. In my distress I called upon the Lord and cried unto my God. He heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him, even into his ears." No matter what piece of literature you read, justice is always personified as a woman. It's a very interesting thing. If you go and you read even the Bible, Proverbs, it talks about justice and judgment being a woman. In Greek mythology, justice is known as the goddess Themis. We see figures of justice in the capital of the United States of America, Washington, D.C. We see justice in many of the halls and courts of law institutions all across the world. From courts and Supreme Courts and law schools, we see justice. She's always personified as a woman. Now, before I go more into justice and what my video is really about, I want to show you first of all, because remember, we're dealing with Justice League. I want to show you first of all something from a trailer in Justice League. So in this trailer, we see this building and it's exploding. And a lot of people thought it was somehow a bank heist. But we all know that this building is known as Old Bailey in London, England. And Old Bailey is an old courthouse from way back in the 1800s. But even more interesting than that is the fact that Old Bailey that we see here can be easily identified. So here's Old Bailey. And if you look at Old Bailey, the exploding part, the part where we see the explosion, is not the old 1800 built building, but it's actually this new section across here. Now, in this picture I'm going to show you right now, this picture of Old Bailey, you see that the old section has at the top of it a statue, a golden statue. And if you look very carefully, this statue has what looks like a pair of scales and a sword. On closer inspection of this statue, which we see at the top of the old section of Old Bailey, we see that this statue looks like this. You know, it almost looks like the Statue of Liberty. Again, we see the pair of scales and we see the sword, and it's at the very pinnacle, the very top of Old Bailey. If I were to show you what it looks like in context, here we see the statue at the top of the very top of Old Bailey, and that's a very tall building, and at the very top of it, we see the statue. I'm zooming in a little bit. Now, if we look in the background of the statue, we see some buildings, and I will come back to these buildings and these landmarks in a minute on the top of Old Bailey, okay? Behind the background, this is London, and these are some of the skyline or skyscrapers of London, and you can see other things in the background, okay? So I was just looking at the modern skyscrapers and structures, superstructures, right? Now, this is the statue. And this statue, I'm going to go into some detail on it. This statue, the title of its statue is Lady Justice. Like I said, justice is known in Greek mythology by the name Themis. Themis, or Thymes, Themis is Lady Justice. And in fact, we have a number of portraits of Lady Justice. Here you see her again. This is at the crowning top of Old Bailey. And let's have a better look at her. She's standing on top of the globe. She's standing on top of the world. She has a pair of scales in one hand, and she has a sword in the other hand, and she's wearing a crown on her head. All right. This is also known as the goddess, like I said, in Greek culture, Themis, or Themis, or Thymes. Here is an artist's depiction of Thymes, again, above the Old Bailey statue. And Thymes goes all the way back. We see her in the Department of Justice in the United States of America without her sword this time and without the scales, but her hands raised high, giving praise for the fact that justice is being done. Thymes is also seen on the courts of the Hall of Justice, but also in the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. Now, you may not be able to see the repeated motif of Thymes here, or what we call Lady Justice, but I will show you. So first of all, if you look here and I zoom in on this, you will see Lady Justice here. This is called the contemplation of justice, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in a second. I'm just zooming in a little bit more so you can see the statue, and there you see the statue of Lady Justice. And she has in her hand, examining in her hand, another statue. And if I were to just zoom in on this a little bit more, this statue here that she's examining has a blindfold on her and a pair of scales. And we'll go into this in more detail right about now. So, coming back to what we began our video with, the figures of justice, we see here on this information sheet that one of the most recognized legal symbols visible in the architecture of the Supreme Court building is the female figure representing justice. As I said before, justice is actually a female virtue. We call it a female energy, we call it female virtue, we call it the female metaphor. Okay? Who is depicted in 3 sepulchral groups portraying justice as a female figure dates back to the depictions of Themis, or Themis, or Thymes, and Justitia in ancient mythology. Themis, or Themis, or Thymes, or whatever you want to call her, known for her clear-sightedness, was the Greek goddess of justice and law. In Roman mythology, Justitia, or justice, was one of the 4 virtues along with prudence, fortitude, and temperance. So you see, these are called virtues. Okay, let's keep it going. So, over time, justice became associated with scales to represent impartiality and a sword to symbolize power. During the 16th century, justice was often portrayed with a blindfold. The origin of the blindfold is unclear, but it seems to have been added to indicate the tolerance of or ignorance to abuse of the law by the judicial system. Today, the blindfold is generally accepted as a symbol of impartiality, but may be used to signify other traits in political cartoons. So here we see, in the contemplation of justice, we see Lady Justice here with a blindfold, and she's holding on to a pair of scales. Okay. Okay, so James Earl Fraser was the one that made it. Now, here we see Lady Justice again. There's a book she has her hand propped up on, and over here she's beholding justice. The Supreme Court basically is the court that examines other courts. So it makes sense that Lady Justice would be contemplating the justice here. Is it impartial? Is it really doing it? And that's what the Supreme Court does. To the left of the steps leading to the main entrance is the Contemplation of Justice by James Earl Fraser. In this sculpture, the seated female figure reflects on a smaller figure of justice that she holds in her right hand, detailed. Notice it's a right hand, the right hand of power. The figure of justice is blindfolded and cradles a set of scales in her arms. Another depiction of justice is on the base of the lamppost located at the front of the building's plaza facing First Street. In these examples, a bas relief of justice depicts her with a blindfold, and she holds scales in her left hand and a sword in her right. The John Donnelly Studio of New York designed the lamppost bases. So if you notice here, she's holding the scales in her left hand and she's holding the sword in her right hand. The right hand of power, that is called. Okay? And all the right hand of power means is that I am able to execute power correctly. So that's why it's called the right hand of power. And these phrasings and these kinds of things were said in biblical times. It was said all over the place, all right, all over the world. I'm just using Washington, D.C. because America is associated with the founding of Wonder Woman, which we're going to get to Wonder Woman. Remember, Wonder Woman in the DCEU is the beginning of justice, right? And that makes sense now because justice is a woman. Let's keep it moving. Now, the last figure that you find on the Supreme Court, well, there's actually more, but we'll go to that, is Justice Without a Blindfold appears in one of the courtroom friezes sculpted by Adolf Wyman. This frieze is located at the top of the west wall at the back of the courtroom. In this work, a robed justice left is focused on the allegorical story of the battle of good versus evil. Let's see if I can kind of get you to see this better. There you go. Her unencumbered gaze is set determinedly in the direction of the forces of evil to the viewer's right. Her posture is defiant, as if ready to do battle, to protect the forces of good with her great sword. The sword remains sheathed, but her hand rests atop the hilt, ready to act should the need arise. This is why Wonder Woman is using a sword. Now, Wonder Woman began with a lasso, but now Wonder Woman has a lasso, she has a sword, and she has a shield. Now, I want to show you something. All right? We'll get to all of this in a minute, but I want to show you something that is very important for you guys to understand. So, the brilliance of Zack Snyder is beyond a doubt this well thought out kind of guy. And why I say this is because you just heard about the figures of justice. I just told you about justice. And you saw the figure of justice on top of Old Bailey. And what you will notice is she has the scales in her left hand where she weighs the justice. And where she executes the justice, she has the sword in her right hand, also known as the right hand of power. Notice her crown. Now, before I go on, I must also mention one more thing concerning the administration of justice with the Supreme Court. Now, if you look in the Supreme Court here, atop the Supreme Court, there's a number of figures, but you may not be able to see them very clearly. So we have the contemplation of justice, which we saw on the right side, again, the right side of the entrance to the Supreme Court building. But there's more. So what I want to show you is this. At the top of the Supreme Court building, which I just showed you before, in a clearer image of this, you will see equals justice under law. And you will see here Lady Justice as the queen. She's in the center of this diagram. On her right side is a knight who is holding a sword in its sheath with a spear. On her left is the rule of law, which is seen as a scribe rolled up in the form of script. So she has the word on her left side. She has the implementation of the word or the law on her right side. And she's holding in her hand the scales to measure the written law versus the implementation or execution of that law. And this is the basis of governance of the judicial system. She has her messengers to carry that out. Justice is a queen. Justice is a woman. Justice has always been female. This is very important for you to remember. Whenever you see a woman around, remember that they are the personification of justice. That the implementation of justice and fairness and impartiality and love are all feminine attributes. Now let's get back to Justice League. So at the top of Old Bailey is Lady Justice. Lady Justice is not exclusive to London. It is an international and a global understanding that this is the metaphor that is used to show justice. Now that we have understood this, we're going to go from there to looking at Old Bailey in this trailer and the connection between Old Bailey, Lady Justice, and Wonder Woman. Now, it's very important for you to understand that Wonder Woman is standing on the right hand of power of Lady Justice. And you will notice she's holding the sword of power of Lady Justice. She is not on the left hand of Lady Justice weighing a matter with scales. She's past that, and she's now going to implement the law of Lady Justice. Now, it's very important to understand that Wonder Woman here is actually, let me zoom in a little bit. So here's Wonder Woman, and she's standing on the right hand of power of Lady Justice, and she is actually in London. She is standing on top of Old Bailey. The statue of Lady Justice on top of Old Bailey. She's actually on top of Old Bailey. How do we know this? Well, when we look at Lady Justice here, which is on top of Old Bailey, we clearly see the background. Now, I must say that I'm able to find out that this is CGI that we're looking at here. And the reason I know this is because the background is actually flipped. It is not in the right orientation to what it's supposed to be if she's standing on top of Lady Justice, which is on top of Old Bailey. How do I know this? Alright, so let's look at the buildings. Like I said, I was going to come back to that. So this building here is to the left. On the sword side, the right side, it's to the right, of Lady Justice here, which Wonder Woman is standing on her right hand of power with her sword. Look at this building structure, the architectural structure. And notice that these structures here are to Lady Justice's left. It's on the left-hand side. It's at an angle shot, but nonetheless. And look at the particular architecture of these buildings. This building here is moving up like this. And then we have this beautiful egg-shaped kind of building here. And we got these little buildings in between. And then you have this cluster of buildings here. Now, when we look at actual Lady Justice here with the backdrop, it is actually inverted. It is the opposite. But Lady Justice's orientation is the same. What do I mean by that? This structure here, which we see over here, is on the wrong side of Lady Justice. This side is on this building here. This structure is inverted and is on the sword side of Lady Justice, which it shouldn't be on. Whereas here, you can see that it's not on the sword side, but it's on the scale side of Lady Justice. So they inverted it. Very, very much so. You see a mirror image of these buildings. This skyscraper is sloped this way. Alright, its triangular slope is actually the opposite of this building here, where its slope is the other way. Can you see that? Slope the other way. And it's also on the left side of Lady Justice here, whereas here it is sloped and it's on the right side of Lady Justice. Okay? And then the egg-shaped building and this nice building here and this cluster of buildings, they are all to the right of this sloped building, whereas when you look here, this egg-shaped building and all of these cluster of buildings and this little building here is to the left of this building here. And everything seems to be a mirror image. So I knew that this had to be CGI because it's impossible to have the building architecture flipped and behind Lady Justice. So if I were them, I'd correct that. I'd flip that back. Unless Zack Snyder's trying to make a statement that this is a virtual world and he's kind of flipping things around just to make it, you know. But yeah, I also know that there's a couple other things I noticed about Lady Justice here that are slightly different to Lady Justice here. Okay, if you look at Lady Justice here, her shape and everything is slightly different to the Lady Justice that they did here with CGI. Alright? There are just slight differences in things. So if you look at this Lady Justice here, you notice her outfit is much more fitted and she's not as big as Lady Justice here. See, Lady Justice here, she's a little bit bigger than Lady Justice here. So I didn't quite get the dimensions correctly. Okay, so we know this is CG versus this is real. This is real Lady Justice here. See, they changed up the nose and stuff. So that's CG. Okay. Not that it matters much to me, but I always think if you're gonna do something real, why? Unless you're doing that for people to get a hint that visually you're flipping around things, you know, I would say, you know, flip it back to where it is, unless that's what they want to do. They want to make it look like that, so they mess with the world a little bit and change up things a little bit. But by and large, I thought that's a beautiful symbology for us to pay attention to. I also love the details on Gal right here. It's nice, interesting details with her on top, holding the sword. You see her with the bracelets on here. It's really cool. I think I may do a video on I don't think I will. Actually, I changed my mind. So yeah, that's basically it. I thought I would share that with you guys. I thought you would enjoy my video, the depth that I go with all my videos. On that note, you guys have a great one.